A 12-year-old boy sat at the defense table with his feet swinging. His shoes didn't touch the ground. His hands rested on the table in front of him. The courtroom was silent. The verdict was about to be read. Everyone knew what was coming. The evidence had been overwhelming. The guilt had been proven beyond any doubt. But what happened in the moments after the guilty verdict would become more important than the verdict itself. As the judge read the words, "guilty," the boy looked directly at the victim's family. And then, slowly and deliberately, he mouthed 4 words. Words that no one heard but everyone saw. "I don't care." A faint shrug followed. A practiced expression of indifference crossed his young face. The victim's mother put her hand over her mouth. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. And in that single moment, a 12-year-old boy revealed something about himself that would change how the entire justice system viewed accountability in children. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't ignore disrespect. It documents it. If you believe that accountability matters at every age, subscribe now and tell us what you think in the comments below. Let's look at how a moment of contempt became the turning point in a case that would set legal precedent. Before the courtroom, there was a neighborhood. A place where children rode bicycles down streets lined with mature trees. A place where families knew each other's names. A place where people felt safe leaving doors unlocked and windows open. The victim was someone in that neighborhood, not famous, not wealthy, not particularly remarkable in any obvious way, but a person who existed in the quiet routine of suburban life. Someone who worked, someone who came home, someone who had relationships and responsibilities and a future that seemed normal and predictable. The boy who would be accused of killing this person also lived in that neighborhood. He was 12 years old. He was small. He was the kind of child that you might see at school or on the street without particularly noticing. But somewhere beneath his ordinary appearance, something was developing. Not anger, not hatred. Something more fundamental than that. An absence of empathy. A disconnection from the feelings of other people. A sense that other people's suffering didn't really matter, that their pain was less important than his own desires, that he was separate from the normal rules that governed human behavior. The courtroom was built like a cathedral, with high ceilings and formal acoustics. Every sound echoed. Every gesture was visible from every angle. The judge sat elevated on his bench, commanding the space through architecture and authority. The jury sat in their box. 12 people who had spent the past 3 weeks listening to evidence, weighing testimony, trying to determine what had happened and who was responsible. The victim's family sat on one side of the gallery. The defendant's family sat on another. They were separated not just by physical space, but by the unbridgeable gulf of opposite interests. One family wanted justice, the other wanted mercy. One family wanted their loved one to be acknowledged and remembered. The other family wanted their child to be understood and protected. The 12-year-old sat at the defense table next to his attorney. The attorney was a woman named Margaret Chen, who had been defending juveniles for 18 years. She had defended children who had committed terrible acts. She had argued for leniency based on their age, their development, their potential for rehabilitation. She believed in the possibility of redemption. She believed that children, even children who had committed serious crimes, deserved the possibility of a second chance. She had made that argument to the jury. She had presented evidence about adolescent development, about the parts of the child's brain that were still developing, about the possibility that he could grow and change and become someone different than the person who had committed the crime. The prosecutor, a man named Robert Martinez, had countered that belief with evidence. He had presented surveillance footage. He had presented forensic evidence. He had presented the testimony of experts who had concluded that the child understood the difference between right and wrong, that he had acted with intent, that his actions were deliberate and calculated. The prosecutor had argued that age was not an excuse for violence. The prosecutor had argued that accountability was necessary, that consequences had to be real and serious, that the justice system had to send a message that even children would be held responsible for their actions. And now the verdict was about to be read. The jury foreperson stood. The courtroom waited. The judge looked toward the jury. The foreperson opened the verdict form. Her hands were shaking slightly. So she had been carrying the weight of this decision for the past 3 days of deliberation. 3 days of wrestling with whether a 12-year-old could truly be held responsible for his actions. 3 days of trying to reconcile the evidence with the defendant's age. 3 days of trying to determine what justice meant in a case like this. The foreperson spoke. Her voice was steady but quiet. The bailiff asked her to speak louder. She repeated herself. On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The word hung in the air. The victim's mother put her hand over her mouth. The defendant's mother made a sound that was something between a cry and a gasp. The judge sat without changing expression, but his eyes noted everything that happened in the courtroom. The defendant sat still for a moment. His feet stopped swinging. He looked at the victim's family, and then, slowly, his lips began to move. Not speaking, not loud enough for anyone to hear, but visible enough for everyone to see. The 4 words moved across his lips like a confession of something darker than the crime itself. I don't care. His eyes locked on the victim's mother as he mouthed the words. The victim's mother's face crumpled. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair with an expression of disbelief. The judge's expression shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. A recognition that something significant had just happened, something that revealed more about the defendant than any witness testimony ever could. The boy added a shrug, a small movement of his shoulders that suggested complete and utter indifference to the verdict that had just been delivered, to the family that was grieving, and to the gravity of what had just been determined. The courtroom erupted. Some people stood up. Some people began to speak. The bailiff called for order. The judge's gavel came down, once, hard. The sound echoed through the courtroom. The judge's face was now clearly angry. The judge looked at the boy with an expression that suggested he was seeing something in the defendant that went beyond the crime itself. He was seeing an absence of something fundamental, an absence of empathy, an absence of understanding, an absence of remorse. The judge called for order again. This time the courtroom listened. The judge said that the sentencing hearing would be postponed. The judge said that what had just occurred in his courtroom would be taken into account when determining an appropriate sentence. The judge said that the defendant's behavior, his apparent complete indifference to the verdict and to the victim's family, revealed something about his character that could not be ignored. The boy was led away from the courtroom. As he was being escorted out, he did not look sad. He did not look frightened. He did not look as though the weight of what had happened was beginning to settle on him. He looked, if anything, almost satisfied, almost as though he had accomplished something, almost as though the attention, the fact that everyone in the courtroom had seen his lips move, had seen his shrug, had witnessed his complete disconnection from the proceedings, was somehow a victory. The judge sat on his bench and made notes, detailed notes about what he had witnessed, notes that would become part of the court record, notes that would inform his decision when the time came to determine an appropriate sentence for a 12-year-old who had committed murder and then mouthed, "I don't care," when he was found guilty. The victim's name was David Martinez. He was 38 years old. He had lived in the same neighborhood for 12 years. He had purchased his house when the real estate market was different, when he had been a younger man with different dreams and different expectations about what his life would become. The marriage that was supposed to last forever had ended in divorce 8 years earlier. The children that were supposed to fill the house had grown up and moved away. But David had stayed. He had stayed in the house. He had stayed in the neighborhood. He had built a life that was quiet and routine and, in its own way, deeply satisfying. His routine was the framework of his existence. He went to work at 5 in the morning. He worked as a manager at a distribution warehouse. He supervised a team of 50 people. He was responsible for making sure that shipments were processed on time, that inventory was managed correctly, that operations ran smoothly. He was good at his job. He was respected by his employees. He was the kind of person that people could count on, that people could depend on, that people could trust to do what he said he would do. He came home in the evening exhausted. He would sometimes have dinner with neighbors. He would sometimes sit on his porch and watch the neighborhood settle into evening. He was a man who had learned to find peace in solitude, in routine, in the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. And the neighborhood where David lived was typical of suburban communities that surrounded most American cities. The houses were built in the 1990s. They were similar in design and construction. The yards were similar in size. The people who lived there were people who worked. They had jobs that required them to be somewhere specific at a specific time. They had families or they lived alone. They had mortgages. They had responsibilities. They had chosen this neighborhood because it seemed safe, because it seemed stable, because it seemed like the kind of place where you could build a quiet life and not be bothered by the chaos of the outside world. David was woven into the fabric of this neighborhood in a way that was quiet but significant. He was the man who would help neighbors with projects around their homes. He was the man who would check on elderly neighbors when he hadn't seen them in a while. He was the man who would remember to ask about someone's sick parent or struggling child. He was not a close friend to anyone in particular, but he was a person that everyone knew, that everyone respected, that everyone felt comfortable approaching if they needed help with something. He was the kind of person who made a community feel stable and secure. The 12-year-old who lived several houses away knew David, but not in any meaningful sense. They had waved at each other on the street. They had exchanged pleasantries at neighborhood gatherings. There was no conflict between them. There was no known tension or animosity. David had no reason to suspect that this child was dangerous. The boy had no reason to harbor resentment toward David. They existed in the same neighborhood, but their lives did not intersect in any significant way. Or at least that was what everyone believed before the night that changed everything. That was what everyone believed before a 12-year-old made a choice that would destroy a life and damage a community. The evening of his death, David had called his ex-wife. They maintained a cordial relationship. They spoke occasionally to check in, to share updates about their adult children, to maintain some connection to the life they had once shared together. In that phone call, David had mentioned that he was thinking about taking a trip. He had mentioned that he had been saving money for something special. He had mentioned that he was considering adopting a dog, that he thought it would be nice to have a companion in his quiet house. He had sounded content. He had sounded like a man who was satisfied with his life, who had made peace with the choices he had made, who had found happiness even though things hadn't worked out the way he had initially planned. That phone call would be the last conversation his ex-wife would have with him. That conversation would be preserved in her memory forever. She would remember his voice. She would remember the topics they discussed. She would remember the sense that he was looking forward to the future, that he had things to look forward to, that his life was moving in a positive direction. Later, after his death, she would think about that conversation frequently. She would think about the things he had mentioned, the trip he would never take, the dog he would never adopt. The future that had seemed so certain and so present in his words would be erased by a single act of violence committed by a child from the neighborhood who understood so little about the impact of what he was about to do. The discovery occurred at 7:43 in the morning. A mail carrier noticed that David's newspaper was still on the driveway. The mail carrier had been delivering mail to this route for 4 years. She knew the residents. She knew their patterns. She knew that David always brought his newspaper inside before he left for work. The newspaper being on the driveway suggested that something was unusual. The mail carrier approached the house and looked through the window. What she saw made her call emergency services immediately. The police arrived within minutes. The first responders noted that the house was quiet. There was no sound of struggle. There was no indication of chaos or violence. The living room was orderly. The television was off. There were no signs of a struggle. The body was in the living room, positioned as though the person had been going about their evening routine when something had interrupted them. The medical examiner noted that the time of death was consistent with the evening before, with the time when the neighborhood was settling into sleep, with the time when most people were inside their homes and doors were locked. The death had occurred quietly. The death had occurred without drawing attention. The death had occurred in a way that suggested no one had witnessed it, no one had heard it, no one had suspected what was happening inside that quiet house. The crime scene investigators moved through the space with methodical precision. They photographed everything. They documented the absence of forced entry. They noted that the door had been unlocked, that the boy had been able to simply knock and be allowed inside. They collected evidence. They took measurements. They noted the position of the body. They observed the absence of defensive wounds, the absence of evidence that David had tried to fight back. The crime scene suggested that the violence had been sudden and overwhelming, that there had been no opportunity for resistance, that what had happened quickly and completely. A doorbell camera on a house across the street had captured footage of a small figure approaching David's house at 7:30 in the evening. The figure was wearing dark clothes. The figure was moving with purpose. The figure was not hesitant or fearful. The figure was walking as though going to an expected destination. The figure had arrived at David's house and had been inside for approximately 15 minutes before leaving. When the figure emerged from the house, the clothing appeared different. The footage was not clear enough to see details, but the investigators noted that something had changed. Something about the way the figure was moving suggested that something significant had occurred inside the house. The neighborhood that had seemed so safe, so secure, so peaceful, had suddenly become something else. A place where violence had occurred, a place where a man had been killed, a place where a child had apparently walked in the evening light to commit an act that defied comprehension. The neighbors learned what had happened through police activity. They learned through the presence of police cars and forensic teams and emergency vehicles. They learned through the gathering of official authority on their quiet street. And they learned, slowly and with growing horror, that the person who had committed this act was someone from the neighborhood, someone they knew, someone's child, a 12-year-old. The investigation began immediately. The evidence was preserved. The body was removed. The house was sealed as a crime scene. And the focus of the investigation turned toward identifying and locating the person who had been captured on the doorbell camera, toward understanding who had killed David Martinez and why, toward answering the question that seemed almost impossible to answer. Why would a 12-year-old child kill his neighbor? The boy was brought in for questioning 2 hours after police had identified him as the person in the doorbell camera footage. He was accompanied by his mother and a lawyer that she had immediately contacted. The boy was placed in an interrogation room with 2 detectives. One detective was a woman named Patricia Morrison, who had been interviewing suspects for 23 years. The other was a man named David Chen, who had specialized in interviewing juveniles suspected of serious crimes. They were experienced at understanding how children responded to questioning, how they constructed narratives, how they sometimes revealed more through what they didn't say than through what they did say. The boy was small for his age. His feet didn't touch the ground when he sat in the chair. A booster seat had been placed on the chair to elevate him slightly. His hands rested on the table in front of him. His mother sat next to him. The lawyer sat on his other side. The detectives sat across from him. They explained his rights. They explained that he was not under arrest, but that they wanted to talk to him about what had happened. The boy said that he understood. His voice was calm. His demeanor was composed. He did not appear nervous or frightened. He appeared, if anything, almost curious about the proceedings, as though he was interested in how the interview would unfold. Detective Morrison asked the boy where he had been the evening before. The boy said that he had been at home. He said that he had spent the evening in his room. He said that he had not left the house. The detectives noted that this statement contradicted the doorbell camera footage. They did not immediately confront him with the contradiction. Instead, they asked additional questions designed to establish a timeline. The boy provided details about what he had watched on television. He provided details about what he had eaten. He provided details that were designed to establish his presence at home during the time of the crime. But his responses had a quality to them that suggested rehearsal. His responses sounded as though they had been practiced. His responses sounded like he had prepared them in advance, like he had thought about what he would say if he was ever questioned. Detective Chen asked about his relationship with David Martinez. The boy said that he didn't really know him. And the boy said that they had waved at each other occasionally but had never had a real conversation. The boy said that he had no reason to have any conflict with David. The boy said that he had nothing to do with what happened to David. As he was saying all of this, the boy's demeanor remained calm. He did not appear nervous. He did not appear frightened. He did not appear to be experiencing the kind of anxiety that would be typical of a 12-year-old who was being questioned by detectives about a murder. Instead, he appeared almost bored. He appeared to be answering questions as a requirement, as though the interview was a task that needed to be completed, but that held no particular emotional significance for him. The detectives looked at each other. They had both interviewed hundreds of suspects, and they had developed an instinct about when someone was telling the truth and when someone was lying. And their instinct told them, clearly and unambiguously, that this boy was lying. Detective Morrison showed him the doorbell camera footage. She asked him to look at the image of a small figure wearing clothes similar to what he was wearing, walking toward David's house at the time of the murder. The boy looked at the footage and said that it wasn't him. He said that it must be another kid from the neighborhood. He said that the footage was unclear and could be anyone. The detectives asked him if he would be willing to provide his clothing from the evening so that they could compare it to what was shown in the video. The boy's mother conferred with the lawyer. The lawyer advised his client not to cooperate with the request. All the interrogation continued for another hour, but no additional information was obtained beyond the boy's repeated denials of involvement. When the interrogation concluded, the detectives had one clear understanding. The boy was lying. His statements did not match the video evidence. His timeline did not align with the information they had obtained from neighbors and forensic evidence. His appearance matched what was shown in the doorbell camera footage. But the detectives also understood that lying during an interrogation is not the same as being guilty of a crime. They had to build a case based on evidence. They had to prove their suspicion through forensic investigation and physical evidence. The interrogation was over, but the investigation was just beginning. The boy was released to his mother's custody. But he was told not to leave the jurisdiction. He was told that further questioning would be necessary. He was told that the investigation was continuing. The digital forensics team began their work immediately. They collected footage from every camera in the neighborhood. They collected the doorbell camera footage from multiple houses. They created a timeline. They mapped the boy's movements from his house to David's house, to the point where he had left the neighborhood. The timestamp data was precise. The camera angles were clear. The evidence was undeniable. The boy had left his house at 7:25 in the evening. He had walked directly to David's house. He had arrived at 7:30. He had left at 7:45. He had returned to his house at 7:55. The timeline matched the estimates of when the crime had occurred based on David's body's condition and the autopsy findings. The clothing that the boy had been wearing when he left his house matched the clothing shown in the doorbell camera footage. The shoes that he had been wearing matched shoe prints that investigators had photographed near David's house. The forensic evidence was accumulating quickly. Every piece of physical evidence seemed to point in the same direction. Every detail seemed to confirm what the detectives had already begun to suspect, that the boy had killed David Martinez. The evidence was building methodically, piece by piece, detail by detail. The boy's phone records were obtained through a warrant. But his location data showed his phone at his house at the beginning of the evening, and then at David's house at the time of the crime. His phone had then returned to his house. The digital footprint was as clear as the physical footprint. The evidence was layering upon itself. With each new piece of data, the case became stronger. With each new investigation, the likelihood of the boy's guilt became more certain. The digital record was undeniable. The boy had been at David's house at the time of the crime. His location data proved it. Friends of the boy were interviewed. Some had noticed that he had been acting strangely in the days before the crime. Some had noticed that he had been asking questions about David Martinez. Some had mentioned that the boy had spoken about wanting to do something that would make him famous. That would make people remember him. That would make him stand out from all the other ordinary kids in the world. These statements were documented. These statements were added to the growing file of evidence. A picture was beginning to emerge of a child who was obsessed with attention, who felt invisible, who wanted to do something dramatic enough that people would finally notice him. The boy's mother was interviewed. She said that her son had seemed troubled lately. She said that he had been struggling at school. She said that he had been having difficulty with his peer relationships. She said that he had expressed frustration with his life and his circumstances. She said that she had tried to help him, tried to talk to him, tried to understand what was bothering him. But she also said that she had never imagined he was capable of violence. She had never suspected that he was planning to harm anyone. She had been shocked by the accusations, shocked by the evidence, shocked by the realization that her son might be capable of what the police were suggesting. The investigation moved forward methodically. The evidence accumulated with relentless consistency. The case that had seemed so uncertain immediately after the crime began to crystallize into something clear and undeniable. The boy had killed David Martinez. The why was less clear than the what and the how, but the basic facts were solid. The timeline was documented. The physical evidence was collected. The digital evidence was preserved. The forensic evidence was analyzed. The witness testimony was obtained. Every piece of the puzzle fit into place with precision. The system that seemed so uncertain in the beginning had found its answer. The answer was that a 12-year-old boy had killed his neighbor and then lied about it. The forensic report was thorough and devastating. The medical examiner had determined the cause of death. The manner of death was homicide. The time of death was consistent with the evening hours. The body had been in the living room, positioned in a way that suggested the violence had been sudden and overwhelming. There were no signs that David had attempted to fight back. There were no defensive wounds. The attack had been swift and complete. The forensic psychologist who reviewed the case noted that the absence of defensive injuries suggested that the victim had not perceived the threat, that he had trusted the person who came to his door, that he had had no reason to be afraid. The shoe impressions found at the crime scene were compared to the shoes that the boy had been wearing. The comparison revealed multiple points of similarity. The wear pattern on the sole of the shoe, the specific marks and characteristics, the way that the shoe had been compressed and worn, all matched the impressions found at the crime scene. An expert testified that the probability of the shoe prints matching by random chance was less than 1 in 10,000. The evidence was clear. The shoes that the boy had worn had left the impressions at David's house. The fiber evidence was analyzed. Fibers from the boy's clothing matched fibers found on David's body. The DNA evidence was processed. Blood from David was found on the boy's clothing. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Every forensic test seemed to produce the same result. The boy had been at David's house. The boy had been in contact with David. The boy had been involved in David's death. The forensic evidence was not circumstantial. It was not subject to interpretation or dispute. It was clear and undeniable. The phone location data was reviewed in detail. An expert from the cellular provider explained how the location services on the boy's phone had tracked his movements. The data showed his phone at his house in the afternoon. The data showed his phone moving through the neighborhood in the evening, arriving at David's house, and then returning to his house. The data was consistent with the surveillance footage. The data corroborated every other piece of evidence. The timeline that had been established by the cameras was confirmed by the digital trail of the phone. The boy's location at the time of the crime was documented and undisputable. A forensic technician testified about the security of the phone data. The technician explained that the location services on modern smartphones provided precise information about location and movement. The technician explained that this information was automatically recorded and transmitted to the phone's manufacturer and the cellular provider. The technician explained that this information could not be manipulated or falsified. The technician explained that the data definitively proved that the boy's phone had been at David's house at the time of the crime. No question, no doubt, no possibility of error. The digital evidence and the physical evidence combined to create a case that was essentially airtight. Every piece of forensic evidence pointed in the same direction. Every detail corroborated every other detail. The timeline was consistent. The physical evidence was consistent. The digital evidence was consistent. The crime scene evidence was consistent. The forensic report was comprehensive and undeniable. The investigation that had seemed so uncertain in the beginning had transformed into something that was absolutely clear. A 12-year-old boy had killed David Martinez. The evidence proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. The system had worked. The truth had been discovered. Justice was beginning its slow movement toward accountability. A comprehensive psychological evaluation of the boy was ordered by the court. A psychologist named Dr. Elizabeth Morrison was assigned to interview the boy and assess his mental state, his capacity to understand the consequences of his actions, his understanding of right and wrong, his psychological profile, and risk factors. Dr. Morrison was a forensic psychologist who had spent 25 years conducting evaluations of juveniles suspected of serious crimes. She had interviewed hundreds of young people. She had learned to recognize patterns in behavior, in speech, in demeanor that suggested various psychological conditions and personality traits. The boy sat across from Dr. Morrison in an interview room. He maintained the same composure that he had displayed during the police interrogation. He answered questions directly and without apparent emotional response. When asked about his feelings regarding David's death, the boy said that he felt bad about it. But when asked to elaborate, when asked to explain what he felt bad about, the boy couldn't articulate a genuine emotional response. He said that he felt bad because people were upset. He said that he felt bad because the situation was difficult, but he did not express sadness about the loss of a human life. He did not express concern about David as a person. He did not display any of the normal emotional responses that would be expected from a 12-year-old who had killed someone. Dr. Morrison asked about the boy's interest in the media coverage of the case. The boy acknowledged that he had been following the news. The boy acknowledged that he was aware that the case was getting attention. When asked how he felt about that attention, the boy's response was telling. He said that he found it interesting. He said that he was curious to see how the case developed. He said that he wanted to know what people were saying about him. His focus seemed to be entirely on himself, on his own situation, on how the crime and its aftermath affected him, rather than on the loss of life or the impact on David's family. Dr. Morrison's assessment was completed and submitted to the court. She noted that the boy displayed characteristics consistent with what psychologists call a personality disturbance. She noted that the boy showed limited capacity for empathy. She noted that the boy seemed primarily focused on his own needs and interests. She noted that the boy's response to his own serious crime seemed more characterized by curiosity and indifference than by remorse or understanding. She noted that these characteristics suggested a level of psychological dysfunction, but she also noted that the boy clearly understood the difference between right and wrong, understood that killing was illegal, and appeared to have acted with conscious intent. The psychologist's report became part of the case file. It became part of the documentation that would be presented to the jury. It became part of the accumulation of evidence that suggested that this was not a case of a confused child acting without understanding. This was a case of a young person who had planned to do something that would attract attention, something that would make him stand out, something that would make people finally notice him. And he had done that. He had killed David Martinez. And he had sat through police interrogation without apparent fear or remorse. He had participated in a psychological evaluation without displaying any genuine emotional response. He was a boy who seemed to be more interested in the attention that his crime was generating than in the crime itself or its consequences. The absence of remorse was the most striking feature of the evaluation. Dr. Morrison had noted that in her 25 years of experience, she had rarely encountered someone so young who displayed such a fundamental absence of guilt. The boy did not cry. The boy did not express sadness. The boy did not demonstrate any understanding that his actions had caused harm. The boy seemed, if anything, satisfied by the attention that the crime had generated. The psychologist concluded her report with a note that the boy presented a significant risk for future violence and that his capacity for rehabilitation was questionable at best. The victim's family began to prepare for trial. David's ex-wife was going to testify. David's adult children were going to testify. David's sister was going to testify. His brother was going to testify. They would all have the opportunity to tell the jury about who David was, about what he meant to them, about the loss they were experiencing. The prosecutor had asked them to prepare impact statements. These statements would be read to the jury, not as evidence of guilt or innocence, but as a way for the jury to understand the full impact of the crime, to understand who had been killed, to understand what had been lost. David's ex-wife sat down one evening and began to write. She wrote about the years they had spent together. She wrote about the divorce and how they had managed to maintain a respectful relationship despite the end of their marriage. She wrote about the phone call on the evening before his death, about the conversation about the trip he wanted to take and the dog he wanted to adopt. She wrote about finding out that he was dead. She wrote about the shock and the grief and the disbelief. She wrote about the person David had been. She wrote about his quiet integrity, his reliability, his ability to make people feel cared for. She wrote about the future that had been taken from him. David's adult children wrote about growing up with a father who had always been present, who had always been dependable, who had always been someone they could count on. They wrote about the father-child relationships that had been destroyed. They wrote about the holidays that would never be the same. They wrote about the grandchildren that he would never meet. They wrote about the loss not just of their father, but of the future they had imagined with him. Each member of David's family was processing their own grief, their own loss, their own sense of injustice about what had been taken from them. Meanwhile, the defendant's family was processing their own crisis. The boy's mother had to confront the reality of what her son had done. She had to process the shock of learning that her child was a murderer. She had to manage the grief of knowing that her son's actions had destroyed a family, that her son had taken a human life, or that her son had apparently done it deliberately and with planning. She had to prepare to sit in court and watch her son be tried for murder. She had to prepare to face the family of the person her son had killed. She had to prepare to hear victim impact statements. She had to prepare to listen to her own child being described as a murderer. The trial would begin in 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, both families would prepare for what was to come. Both families would have to sit in the same courtroom, separated by an aisle, but connected by the terrible event that had brought them together. Both families would have to witness the legal proceedings. Both families would have to listen to evidence. Both families would have to hear the jury determine what had happened. The trial would be the center of their lives for the coming weeks. The trial would be the thing that they thought about when they woke up. The trial would be the thing that kept them awake at night. The prosecutor met with David's family. He explained the process. He explained what to expect. He explained that the trial would be difficult, that they would have to listen to the evidence being presented, that they would have to hear arguments about what had happened. He explained that the verdict would come at the end of the trial. He explained that if the defendant was found guilty, there would be a sentencing hearing where the judge would determine an appropriate punishment. He explained that the process would be long and difficult and painful. He explained that there was no way to make what had happened right, but that the justice system would do its best to acknowledge the loss and to hold the person responsible. The trial began on a Monday morning in late autumn. The weather was cool and gray. The courtroom was filled with media and community members who had read about the case and wanted to see the 12-year-old boy who was accused of killing his neighbor. The gallery was crowded. The media section was full. The jury had been carefully selected through a process of questioning designed to determine if potential jurors could be fair and impartial despite the media coverage and the public interest in the case. The judge was a man named Marcus Blackwell. He had been a judge for 22 years. He had presided over hundreds of cases, including many involving juvenile defendants. He had developed a kind of institutional knowledge about how the justice system worked, about how people responded under stress, about how the law should be applied to young people who had committed serious crimes. He was respected by both prosecutors and defense attorneys. He was known for running a courtroom with strict rules and clear expectations. He did not tolerate disruption. He did not tolerate disrespect. He believed that the courtroom was a place where the law was applied fairly and consistently. The boy entered the courtroom. He was small. He was 12. He wore appropriate clothing. He was in restraints that connected his wrists to a chain around his waist. The restraints were necessary for security, but they were also symbolically significant. They announced to everyone in the courtroom that this boy was considered dangerous, that he was being held because he was suspected of a serious crime, that he was not a free person. He sat at the defense table next to his attorney. His mother was in the gallery behind him. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had not slept well, who was carrying a weight that was becoming unbearable, who was about to face the reality of what her son had done. The opening statements began. The prosecutor stood and addressed the jury. She outlined the evidence. She explained the timeline. She promised the jury that the evidence would be clear and overwhelming. She promised that when the trial concluded, they would have no doubt about the boy's guilt. She promised to prove that the defendant had killed David Martinez deliberately and with planning. The defense attorney stood and addressed the jury, and he acknowledged that something terrible had happened. He asked the jury to consider the boy's age, his youth, his lack of prior criminal history. He argued that while the boy might have been involved in the incident, the circumstances were unclear and the evidence could be interpreted in different ways. It was a weak argument, but it was the best argument available to someone defending an indefensible case. The jury was sworn in. The trial began. The prosecution's first witness took the stand. The evidence began to accumulate. With each testimony, with each presentation of physical evidence, the case against the boy became clearer. The jury watched intently. The boy watched with apparent curiosity. David's family sat in the gallery and listened to the details of how their loved one had died. The trial that was expected to last 3 weeks began its slow progress toward a verdict that everyone in the courtroom already knew was coming. The surveillance footage was played for the jury. The video showed a small figure in dark clothes walking down a suburban street. The quality was clear enough that the general size and shape could be identified. The quality was clear enough that the clothing could be recognized. The video showed the boy walking toward David's house at 7:25 in the evening. The video showed him arriving at the front door. The video showed him departing at 7:45 in the evening. The timestamp was precise. The timeline was irrefutable. The jury watched the footage with the kind of focused attention that comes from understanding that they were watching evidence of a serious crime. A detective testified about the doorbell camera footage. The detective explained the timeline. The detective explained how the footage corresponded to the estimated time of death. The detective explained that the clothing in the footage matched clothing found in the boy's room. The detective explained that the shoes in the footage matched shoes found at the crime scene. The evidence was systematic and undeniable. The jury took notes. Some jurors looked at the boy. Some jurors looked away. The message was clear. This boy had been at David's house at the time of the crime. Phone location data was presented. An expert from the cellular provider explained how the location services on the boy's phone had tracked his movements. The data showed his phone at his house in the afternoon. The data showed his phone moving through the neighborhood in the evening. The data showed his phone at David's house at the time of the crime. The data showed his phone returning to his house after the murder. The timeline was consistent. The data was undisputable. The expert testified that there was no possibility of error or manipulation. The data definitively placed the boy at David's house at the time of David's death. Forensic evidence was presented. A forensic technician testified about the physical evidence found at the crime scene. The technician explained that fibers from the boy's clothing had been found on David's body. The technician explained that shoe impressions found at the crime scene matched the shoes the boy had been wearing. The technician explained that blood from David had been found on the boy's clothing. The technician explained that the probability of all of this evidence being coincidental was essentially zero. The evidence was overwhelming. The medical examiner testified about the cause of death. The cause was blunt force trauma. The injuries were consistent with a violent assault. The injuries were consistent with the murder weapon that had been recovered. The time of death, based on the body's condition, was consistent with the evening hours, consistent with the time when the boy had been at David's house. The evidence was clinical, precise, and absolutely clear. Day after day, witness after witness took the stand. Day after day, piece after piece of evidence was presented. The defense attorney had few weapons to use against the overwhelming evidence. He cross-examined witnesses, but the witnesses' testimony remained consistent. Marhi challenged the forensic evidence, but the forensic evidence was sound. He argued that his client deserved consideration based on his age, but the evidence of premeditation and planning suggested that age alone could not excuse what had been done. The boy sat at the defense table and watched the evidence mount against him. Slowly, over the course of the trial, his demeanor began to change. His initial composure began to crack. His certainty about his ability to escape the consequences began to erode. By the end of the prosecution's case, he looked less like a boy who was curious about the proceedings and more like a boy who was beginning to understand the gravity of his situation. The jury deliberated for 4 days. 4 days of reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, wrestling with the question of guilt and innocence. Of 4 days of reviewing the forensic reports, the timeline, the phone data, the surveillance footage. 4 days of trying to determine whether the evidence was sufficient to convict a 12-year-old of murder. But there was little doubt about what the verdict would be. The evidence was too clear. The timeline was too precise. The physical evidence was too damning. Every juror understood what had to happen. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the jury sent a note to the judge indicating that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled. Everyone who had any connection to the case returned to their seats. The boy was brought from the holding area. His mother was in the gallery. David's family was in the gallery. The media was in the gallery. The judge entered and took his seat. The jury entered and took their seats. Yet the 4 persons stood when asked if they had reached a verdict. They had. The judge asked for the verdict. On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The word hung in the air. The jury had found the boy guilty of murder. The evidence had been sufficient. The testimony had been sufficient. The forensic evidence had been sufficient. The boy was guilty. The victim's mother put her hand over her mouth. The victim's children gripped each other's hands. The boy's mother made a sound that was something between a cry and a gasp. The boy sat still for a moment. His feet stopped swinging, and then he looked at the victim's family. He looked directly at them, made eye contact with David's mother, looked at David's children, and his lips began to move. His mouth formed words, words that were not spoken but were visible. Words that everyone in the courtroom could see. Words that captured something fundamental about the boy's character, about his understanding, about his capacity for empathy and remorse. 4 words. I don't care. His eyes stayed locked on David's family as he mouthed the words. A slight shrug followed, a movement of his shoulders that suggested complete and utter indifference to the verdict that had just been delivered, to the family that was grieving, to the severity of what had just been determined. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some people stood up involuntarily. Some people began to speak. The bailiff called for order. The judge's gavel came down, once hard. The sound echoed through the courtroom. The judge's face was now clearly angry. The judge looked at the boy with an expression that suggested he was seeing something in the defendant that he hadn't fully recognized before. He was seeing an absence of something fundamental, an absence of empathy, an absence of understanding, an absence of any recognition that what he had done was wrong. Judge Blackwell waited for the commotion in the courtroom to die down. His expression was controlled, but his anger was evident. He called the court to order. He looked directly at the boy. He said that what had just occurred in his courtroom was unprecedented. He said that the gesture that the boy had made, the words that he had mouthed, the shrug that had followed, revealed a profound expression of disrespect. He said that it demonstrated an attitude that was inconsistent with remorse or understanding. The judge said that he had presided over many cases involving young defendants. He said that he had seen many children respond to serious charges in many different ways. He said that he had seen children cry. He said that he had seen children appear confused or frightened. He said that he had rarely seen a child respond to a guilty verdict with such complete indifference, such apparent satisfaction, such a complete disconnection from the gravity of what had just been determined. The judge explained that the mouthed words would not be forgotten. The judge said that the contempt that the boy had displayed would be taken into account when determining an appropriate sentence. The judge said that the gesture revealed something about the boy's character, about his capacity for understanding and empathy, about his fundamental suitability for rehabilitation. The judge said that the words and the gesture were evidence of something that was deeply troubling, that suggested a young person who was incapable of understanding the impact of his actions on others. The judge said that he was immediately postponing the sentencing hearing. The judge said that he needed time to consider what he had just witnessed, to think about how to proceed with a case involving a defendant who seemed so completely unable to comprehend the reality of his situation. The judge said that what had happened in the courtroom would become part of the permanent record. The judge said that it would be documented. The judge said that it would be considered when any decision about sentencing or rehabilitation was made. The judge ordered that the boy be remanded to custody. The judge ordered that the boy have no contact with the media. The judge ordered that the boy not be permitted to make any statements that might be recorded or publicized. The judge was putting limits on the boy's ability to further perform, to further seek attention, to further use the courtroom or any other platform as a stage for whatever psychological needs were driving his behavior. The boy's expression changed. For a moment, he seemed to understand that he had made a serious mistake. For a moment, he seemed to grasp that the gesture, which he had apparently intended to be defiant or powerful or meaningful, had actually revealed something about himself that was deeply damaging. The courtroom was silent. The weight of what had just happened seemed to settle on everyone in the room. A 12-year-old boy had been found guilty of murder. And then, in the moment after the verdict, he had revealed, through a single gesture, an absence of remorse so profound that it seemed to change the entire nature of the case. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after the verdict. 2 weeks of the boy sitting in juvenile detention, contemplating what had happened, perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of the consequences that he was about to face. 2 weeks of his mother struggling with the reality of what her son had done, what her son was, what her son would become as a result of his conviction. 2 weeks of the community processing the guilty verdict, processing the mouthed words, processing the realization that a child from the neighborhood had killed David Martinez and had shown no remorse, and had shown no understanding, had shown nothing but a kind of detached indifference to the gravity of what he had done. On the day of the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was full again. The media was there. The community was there. David's family was there. The boy's family was there. The judge entered and took his seat. The judge looked at the boy. His expression suggested that he had had time to think about the case, to process what had happened, to consider what was appropriate in terms of a sentence. The prosecutor stood and made his sentencing recommendation. He talked about the severity of the crime. He talked about David's life and what had been taken from him. He talked about the evidence of planning and premeditation. He talked about the boy's apparent complete lack of remorse. The prosecutor pointed out that the boy, even after being found guilty of murder, had mouthed words suggesting that he did not care about what had happened. The prosecutor argued that this demonstrated a level of psychological dysfunction that was deeply disturbing. The prosecutor recommended a sentence of 30 years, which would mean that the boy would not be eligible for parole until he was in his 40s, until he had spent his entire childhood and young adulthood in custody. The defense attorney stood and made arguments about the boy's age. He talked about adolescent development. He talked about the neurological changes that were still occurring in the teenage brain. He talked about the possibility of rehabilitation. He asked the judge to consider the boy's potential for change, his potential for growth, his potential for becoming someone different than the person who had committed the crime. He asked for leniency, for a sentence that would acknowledge the boy's youth, but would also hold him accountable for his actions. David's ex-wife stood and read her victim impact statement. She talked about David as a person. She talked about his quiet integrity, his reliability, his ability to care for others. She talked about the loss, about the future that had been taken from him. She talked about the fact that a 12-year-old child had killed him and then showed no remorse. Her words were powerful and devastating. When she finished, there was absolute silence in the courtroom. Even the boy seemed affected by her words, though his reaction was difficult to interpret. Judge Blackwell listened to all of it, and then he spoke. He addressed the boy directly. He said that the boy had committed a terrible crime. He said that the evidence was overwhelming. He said that the boy's apparent lack of remorse was concerning. He said that the gesture that the boy had made after the verdict, the mouthed words, had revealed something about his character that could not be ignored. He said that he had considered the boy's age carefully. He said that he understood that the boy was young, that the boy's brain was still developing, that there was theoretically a possibility of rehabilitation. But, the judge continued, there was a line that separated childhood mistakes from calculated violence. There was a line between youthful indiscretion and premeditated murder. The judge said that the boy had crossed that line. The judge said that the boy had killed a man who had done nothing to him, who had posed no threat to him, who had simply existed as a neighbor in the same community. The judge said that this act could not be excused by age alone. The judge said that accountability was necessary. The judge said that the community needed to know that there would be consequences for taking another person's life, even if the person taking the life was a child. The judge sentenced the boy to 28 years in prison. The judge said that the boy would not be eligible for parole consideration until he had served at least 20 years. The judge said that during those 20 years, the boy would have the opportunity to develop remorse, to understand what he had done, to become a different person. But the judge made clear that this was not a guarantee. The judge said that if, at the time of the parole hearing, the boy still showed no remorse, still showed no understanding of what he had done, parole could be denied. The judge said that the boy's future, his possibility of ever being released from prison, depended entirely on his capacity to change, to grow, and to develop a genuine understanding of the harm he had caused. The gavel fell. The sentence was final. The boy had been found guilty and sentenced to 28 years in prison. He would spend his childhood in prison. He would spend his adolescence in prison. He would spend his young adulthood in prison. He would not be free until he was in his early 40s at the earliest. The mouthed words that he had thought would be powerful, that he had thought would be significant, had instead become the moment that had sealed his fate. The media coverage of the sentencing was extensive. News outlets across the country reported on the case. The focus of the coverage was not just the verdict and the sentence, but the moment after the verdict, the mouthed words, the gesture that had revealed the boy's complete disconnection from the gravity of his crime. The image of the 12-year-old boy mouthing, "I don't care," became symbolic. It became a representation of youth disconnected from empathy, of children who seemed incapable of understanding the impact of their actions on others, of the challenge that the justice system faced in dealing with young offenders who displayed such fundamental absence of remorse. Legal scholars began to analyze the case. They discussed the judge's response. They discussed whether the mouthed words should have been considered evidence of the boy's psychological state. They discussed how courts should treat displays of disrespect during sentencing proceedings. They discussed how the justice system should approach juvenile offenders who showed no remorse. The case became a reference point for discussions about juvenile justice. It was cited in legal arguments. It was discussed in law schools. It was analyzed in psychology courses. The legal community recognized that Judge Blackwell had made a decision that was unusual, that had not been clearly articulated in prior legal precedent. By taking the boy's display of contempt into account when determining the sentence, the judge had essentially said that behavior in the courtroom, a behavior that revealed the defendant's psychological state and his capacity for empathy, was a legitimate factor in sentencing determinations. The decision would likely be challenged on appeal. But for now, it stood as a kind of watershed moment in how the justice system treated juvenile offenders. David's family was left with the permanent reality of his absence. His ex-wife had to process the loss and the strange trauma of knowing that a child, a neighbor, a 12-year-old, had killed the man she had once loved. His children had to process the loss of their father and the complicated feelings that came from watching the person who had killed him receive a sentence that allowed for the possibility of parole, that allowed for the possibility that he might someday be free while their father was dead, while the void that he had left would never be filled. The community gradually moved past the case. New families moved into houses on David Street. The neighborhood recovered from the trauma. But there was something different now. There was an awareness that bad things could happen, that children could commit terrible acts, that suburban safety was not guaranteed. There was a recognition that you couldn't always know what was happening inside the homes around you, that you couldn't always predict who was dangerous and who wasn't, that the normal-looking neighbor could harbor darkness that you never fully understood until it was too late. The boy sat in his cell and grew older. He had years ahead of him, decades perhaps, depending on whether he was ever granted parole, depending on whether he ever demonstrated the kind of change that would convince a parole board that he was safe to release. The mouthed words that he had made in the courtroom were long ago now, a moment from a different life, a moment from a time when he had thought that his indifference was a kind of power, that his ability to not care was something to be proud of. He had been wrong. He had learned, perhaps, or perhaps he had not. Only he could know the truth of what went on inside his own mind. The courthouse steps where the boy had been photographed being led in restraints were now just steps. The courtroom where the trial had taken place was now just a room. The gallery where David's family had sat was now just seating. The spaces where the drama had unfolded had been absorbed back into the ordinary machinery of justice. had become the setting for other cases, other dramas, other stories of crime and consequence. Judge Blackwell was asked about the case in an interview some years later. He was asked about the mouthed words. He said that he had thought about that gesture many times over the years. He said that it was the most revealing moment in the entire trial, that it had shown him something about the boy that no amount of expert testimony could have revealed. He said that the mouthed words had demonstrated an absence of understanding, an absence of empathy, an absence of any recognition of what he had done. He said that it was the kind of moment that reminded him why the justice system existed, why accountability was necessary, why consequences had to be real and permanent. The case was cited in legal discussions about how juveniles should be treated in the criminal justice system. Some people argued that the boy's sentence was too harsh, that youth should be weighed more heavily in sentencing decisions. Some people argued that the boy's sentence was too light, that the severity of the crime and the apparent lack of remorse should have resulted in a harsher sentence. The case became evidence for different positions in an ongoing debate about how to balance accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation, punishment with the hope for change, the protection of society with the understanding that people could grow and change. The mouthed words themselves had become famous in a way that the boy had never intended. They had become a symbol. They had become a teaching moment. They had become the most famous moment from the trial, more famous than the evidence, more famous than the testimony, more famous than the verdict itself. The image of the 12-year-old boy mouthing, "I don't care," was an image that stuck with people, that haunted them, that made them think about the nature of youth and responsibility and the ways that sometimes a single gesture could reveal everything about a person. David Martinez's memory was preserved in the stories that his family told about him. He was remembered as a quiet man who had lived a good life, who had been a good neighbor, who had deserved better than what had happened to him. He was not remembered primarily as the man who was killed by the 12-year-old boy. He was remembered as a person, who as a man with qualities and characteristics and a presence that had meant something to the people who had known him. His life had been cut short, but the impact of his life, the memory of who he had been, remained in the consciousness of the people he had touched. The boy, now growing older in prison, existed in a different kind of memory. He was remembered as the child who had killed his neighbor. He was remembered as the boy who had mouthed, "I don't care," when he was found guilty. He was remembered as the person who had revealed, through his own actions and gestures, an absence of the basic human capacity for empathy and understanding. Whether that was who he truly was, whether he would ever change, whether he would ever develop a genuine understanding of what he had done. These questions remained unanswered, perhaps permanently unanswered, perhaps not to be answered until or unless he was released from prison and given the opportunity to demonstrate that he had become someone different than the person he had been. The courtroom where the trial had taken place continued to operate. The judge who had presided over the case continued to hear cases. The prosecutors continued their work. The community continued forward. And somewhere in a prison cell, a young man sat with the consequences of choices he had made when he was 12 years old. He had wanted to be remembered. He had achieved that goal. He was remembered. But the memory was not the one he had imagined. The mouthed words were not remembered as a gesture of defiance or power. They were remembered as a revelation of his own emptiness, a moment when he had revealed to everyone watching, in the absence of anything resembling a conscience. The gavel had fallen, the trial was over, the sentence was served, and the mouthed words once made could never be unmade. They existed now in the permanent record of the case, in the memories of everyone who had witnessed them, in the digital archives of news coverage, in the consciousness of a community that had been touched by the terrible reality that violence could come from anywhere, that evil was sometimes smaller and younger than people expected, that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who understood so little about the harm they caused that they seemed genuinely satisfied when they caused it.